We have with us today Dan Renberg, who is the head of government relations for Arent Fox. And then we also have two members of the law firm's international trade group. One is Georgi, who is the leader of that international trade group, and we'll get her in here shortly. And then the other is Leah Scarpelli, who's also in the international trade group. What they have prepared for us is a little bit of a round robin amongst themselves, which I don't think requires much facilitation from me. So I'm going to kick it over to Dan to get things started. And then I'm going to go see if I can't rescue their colleague and get her teed up for her section of the discussion. So with that, Dan,
Thank you. All right. I can't help but say, Houston, we have a problem.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So with that being said, it's a real privilege to be part of this. We were so glad when Bob Ernest reached out to the three of us and asked if we could offer some insight as to what to expect from an incoming Biden administration and the new Congress. My background is in lobbying, having worked in public service on the Hill and as a board member of the Export-Import Bank. And Leah and Kay are practitioners on a daily basis in the area of international trade regulatory law. I'm going to try to give you a bit of a political insight into what to expect, and then they're going to talk maybe a little more substantively about some of the issues that you care passionately about. So I'm going to get started. We now have Kay, and she'll follow me, and then Leah will go after that. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to assume that Joe Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th. To the extent that offends anyone, I apologize, but I'm trying to deal in the world of the real right now, and I think that's where we are. In terms of what to expect, I want to start first with the Congress, the House of Representatives. Significant difference starting January 3rd when the new Congress comes in is that the House Democrats will have a historic low margin. Their majority may only be 4 or 5 above the 218 that you need to have a majority to pass legislation. It's the lowest House Democratic majority since World War II. That's going to possibly tie Speaker Pelosi's hands to some degree as she tries to implement not only their own initiatives, but that of a new Democratic administration. Right now, it's 222 to 210 with 3 races still undecided. If you ever wonder whether or not your vote matters, I would point to Iowa, where in one of the congressional districts, a Republican is ahead after the recount by 6 votes. She will be sworn in, we expect, as a new Republican member of Congress, and she's won apparently by only 6 votes out of 396,000 votes. Just incredible. With respect to the House, one of the dynamics you should keep an eye on is that, as I said, Speaker Pelosi can't risk defection of more than a handful of members on anything that is not bipartisan. And that creates an interesting dynamic because you've got progressives on the left in her caucus who are going to be agitating for real change as they see it, and they'll be pressing the Biden administration for real change on issues like climate and health and energy, for instance, and environment. Are they going to try to obstruct their leadership? And what happens to the more moderate and centrist Democrats? All it takes is 5 or 6 of them to say to the Speaker, we're not going to support you on this parliamentary maneuver, and she has to go back to the drawing board. So what we're wondering is whether or not the progressives are going to be kind of like a Tea Party on the left, and they're going to create just as much havoc for Speaker Pelosi as former Republican speakers used to have to contend with the Tea Party on the conservative Republican side. There are 55 new House members at a minimum and 7 new senators, and a record-breaking number of women are going to be in the 117th Congress. The House of Representatives added 25 new congresswomen, just to point that out. In the Senate, everyone's been hearing about Georgia. What we're expecting from our firm's perspective is that the Senate is likely to remain in Republican hands in terms of a majority. It is currently, as of today, with Mark Kelly, former astronaut, being sworn in as a Democratic senator from Arizona. He beat a Republican incumbent. Right now, the numbers are going to be 52-48, but the 2 Georgia seats are the ones that are left in the balance. So as of January 3rd, it'll be 50-48 because their 2 terms have ended. And then the question will be whether or not it's 50-50. Does it go back to 52-48 or 51-49? The Georgia runoff on January 5th is going to delay some of the committee organizing that needs to take place, because they frankly won't know which party will be in the majority in the Senate until after that. There have been no changes in the Senate and House elected leadership, so you'll see the status quo continue there, with McConnell and Schumer doing their best as their party's leaders, and you'll have Kevin McCarthy and Speaker Pelosi in the House as well. I'm going to cover trade policy from a more macro level perspective, and then a little bit on transportation, which I believe is important to all of you. With respect to my former agency, the Export-Import Bank, I got to work with many of your companies when I was on the board there, and I think that it's been in very nice hands. Chairman Kim Reed has done I think a very nice job of helping move the agency along. The best thing, her term will be up. The best thing you've got going for you if you depend on Ex-Im financing is that it was reauthorized by Congress for a fairly long period of time. Also, I believe that the incoming Biden administration will be supportive of Ex-Im Bank and will know how to leverage it in terms of supporting U.S. jobs. So I'm very optimistic. In terms of trade policy, when I talk about that, I mean the tariff issues and free trade agreements and things like that. Government by tweet should give way to something a little bit more stable. You won't have to turn on your phone at 6 a.m. shuddering to think of what might have just happened in your area of expertise, in your company's area. President-elect Biden is going to inherit a trade environment that's been quite full of conflict, and notwithstanding the fact that COVID and stimulus are going to be the two things that he focuses on 98% of the time, trade is going to rear its ugly head from time to time, and he will have no choice but to depend on it, to get involved in it. You can depend on that. Recently, he said that he wasn't looking for punitive trade. He didn't like the idea of poking our finger in the eyes of our friends and allies and embracing autocrats. Those are Biden's words. And he said he has a thorough plan and he'll be unveiling it after January 21st. In the transition, the trade review team that's been going to USTR and Commerce and looking at what needs to be done has included several labor advocates, including many that were involved in the USMCA negotiations. Others served in the Obama White House on the National Economic Council. When you look at his initial appointments, Janet Yellen for Secretary of Treasury, Brian Deese to be the head of the National Economic Council, Celia Rouse, Princeton University professor who would be the head of the Council on Economic Advisors, you're seeing a fairly centrist group of folks. And if you are inside the Beltway and you read up on this stuff, you'll see that a lot of progressives are actually starting to wring their hands a little bit, wondering, they feel that they were instrumental in getting him the win, and they're wondering whether or not there will be true progressives at the table in multiple seats. But right now we're seeing some fairly centrist folks. In fact, for the U.S. Trade Representative's position, one of the leading candidates is thought to be a congressional staffer, a Democratic Ways and Means Committee staffer named Catherine Tai, who's been called a corporate Democrat by some progressives. I've met with her. She used to be at USTR. She's fluent, if I'm not mistaken, in Mandarin. She would likely be an excellent candidate for the position, but we'll have to see who gets that kind of a position, who will take over from Bob Lighthizer. Trump's trade policy, it's no surprise to any of you, is focused on tariffs and duties, renegotiation of NAFTA, abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and often using national security as a cover for things he wanted to do in the area of aluminum and steel tariffs. As an example, lots of tariffs imposed on European imports because of the Airbus-Boeing fight. We think Biden may be less tariff heavy in his approach, and he's going to look to multilateral collaboration more than Trump, including a re-engagement with the WTO. The Business Roundtable has called on the president-elect to reinsert the U.S. into a lot of multilateral institutions like the WTO. I think it reflects the pent-up demand in the business community for that kind of approach, that kind of engagement. The pandemic seems to make it even more essential to reduce trade barriers and to support U.S. manufacturers. So we expect the new administration is going to make this a higher priority than it might have been otherwise. And so that's where, when they're thinking about how to stimulate the U.S. economy, trade might find its way into the room and be addressed like that. We might see some initiatives there. One of the calculations that the Biden administration will have to make in the area of trade is that they're dealing with a House Democratic majority, but then a Republican majority, most likely in the U.S. Senate. And they have not always seen eye to eye. President-elect Biden We'll have some early bilateral free trade agreement opportunities, such as the U.S.-UK negotiations and also the recently launched U.S.-Kenya free trade agreement talks. His campaign staff, his transition team, have tried to lower expectations, though, to say that any free trade agreement work would have to take place after the first 100 days because they're going to be laser focused on the pandemic and a series of what they've called dramatic domestic investments. It's important for you to consider that climate change provisions will likely be part of future FTAs under a Biden administration. You might have seen that former Secretary of State and former Senator John Kerry, who's closely identified with climate change issues, will be his climate change czar in the new administration. So that's an example of the priority it will be given. China trade will continue to be a problem for American trade policy, but we think that trade-sensitive stakeholders, and many of you might fit that bill, are going to lean on the administration and Congress and force more of a multilateral approach with our allies instead of what has taken place. One last thing on trade policy, the Trade Promotion Authority, what used to be called Fast Track. It's a parliamentary procedural structure that allows for expedited consideration of any free trade agreements that are arrived at. That authority by statute expires June 30th. And so Congress will have to affirmatively enact legislation to resurrect that kind of expedited procedure. And it's kind of that up or down vote on trade agreements that you've seen in the past. We don't know that Congress will be able to pass a new Trade Promotion Authority bill between now and June 30th. It will likely be extended informally without any changes, but then there will have to be at some point a coming together between Republicans and Democrats and the White House to figure out what kind of procedures there will be going forwards. In terms of the committees that you should care about, in the Finance Committee in the Senate, there will be a change from Chuck Grassley of Iowa to the incoming chairman we expect will be Mike Crapo of Idaho. Very, very active on agricultural trade issues. He's been a kind of an ardent free trader. Ron Wyden, the senator from Oregon, will continue as the ranking Democrat or conceivably the chairman on Senate Finance if the party majority changes. With the House Democrats continuing in the majority, Richard Neal of Massachusetts will remain in place on the Ways and Means Committee, and Earl Blumenauer will be the Trade Subcommittee chairman. Kevin Brady from Texas, a fantastic member we work with a lot, will continue as the top Republican on the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which has that trade jurisdiction. I'll shift quickly to transportation in my last couple of minutes here, just to let you know, many of you, as I understand, care about logistics and other issues in this country. Transportation means a lot to a lot of folks. Will there be an infrastructure bill? That's one of the questions we get a lot. The question is not, should there be an infrastructure bill? Everyone agrees that there should be one. The problem is whether or not Congress will try to pay for it, if the new administration will try to pay for it by cutting other spending. And that's been what's held up, or coming up with new revenue sources. That's what's held it up for the last few years. And so there needs to be a coming together to say we have an abject horror in some parts of our country in terms of the roads, the bridges. Trillions of dollars are needed to throw at this. The question is whether or not anyone will go for an increase in the gas tax or a vehicle miles traveled option, because as you know, the electric vehicles don't buy gas at the pump, and so therefore they're not paying into the Highway Trust Fund, which funds highways, bridges, and mass transit, which you depend on certainly in Houston and other places. So it's going to take some time. Chairman Richard Neal said recently, I was on a Zoom call with him and some other stakeholders, and he said that he wants to make it a high priority. He's already been talking to the Biden transition. So I think you'll see, as part of stimulus discussions to get the economy going again, we're going to get a first 6 months of the year, we're going to get a lot of momentum and a lot of enthusiasm about infrastructure spending that would involve broadband deployment. It would involve ports. But at the end of the day, unless they decide to spend another $1 trillion without a budgetary offset, they are going to have to find a funding mechanism that can withstand pot shots from the extremes. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Georgi, and I'd be more than happy to stick around and answer questions, of course. And thank you, Rita, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dan. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent, excellent. I don't know who has control of the slides. I'm hoping that's my colleague, Leah.
Sorry, it's not. I don't have control of the slides. Or actually, yes, I do. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All right. So we have a long list of things I was hoping to cover. I'm not going to hit go into the details in the weeds, but just to give you an idea of where I think things might be moving. So first, let's talk about Huawei. As you all know, Huawei has been an issue since last year. They were put on the entity list last year, and then the Department of Commerce has changed the rules for Huawei to include changes to the way they determine non-U.S. items are subject to U.S. law. It's called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. And it's really, really expanded out what things are subject to U.S. law and export control rules and to include lots of semiconductors and other technological items that are made, say, in Taiwan or Singapore, if they're the direct product of certain U.S. technology. It's been a huge expansion. And it came out kind of roughly. So the real question is, what is a Biden administration going to do with this foreign direct product rule, which is so broad and expansive? Are they going to keep it? Are they going to roll it back? So the clarification here is one that this is one of a number of different things that the Trump administration is leaving the Biden administration, which provides ammunition in the fight against China. So it's one of these items where I think there may be a rollback eventually, but I don't see it coming out of the box. Sorry about the joke. I don't see it coming out of the box immediately as soon as the Biden administration rolls into town. First of all, as you've heard from Dan, the Biden administration has other things to fight first, starting with COVID. But second of all, it is a quiver in the arrow of things that they have to face China with and to work with allies with. So it's something that I think is going to be around. I think it may be tweaked because it is awfully broad, but I don't think it's going to be moving anywhere immediately. Another major change on the export control side were the military end use rule changes. In a nutshell, these is a change made in April, increasing the controls on items being shipped from the U.S. to military end uses and military end users in China, Russia, and Venezuela. Essentially, a lot more items were included in the list that was subject to this, and the definitions of military end use and military end user were expanded pretty substantially. So a big expansion here. In addition, and this is something that's still coming down the pike, in the Trump administration is trying to push a lot of things out in the last few days. And one of the things that's about to come out is an additional list of, I think it's 117 companies in China and Russia that will be subject to this rule. And it hasn't hit the Federal Register yet, so I'm telling you about it. So the expansion continues on. And it will continue on until the Trump administration leaves and the Biden administration comes in. So what's going to happen there? Frankly, I don't think anything's going to happen there. I don't think they're going to roll back this big change. It would require a rule change to supplement 2 to Part 744 and to supplement 744. They may provide additional clarity, but I think everything is marching along in order, and I think that the Biden administration is not going to be wasting its time on rolling back the military end use rule because it has a fair amount of support, particularly in Congress. So that's sort of where I think that one is going. There are a couple other things that happened this year. There was a specific license exception called civil end users in China and other D1 countries, and that license exception was removed altogether. In addition, there was a proposed rule to remove a license exception called APR, which essentially, if you export something to an ally in the Wassenaar arrangement, say you export it to Germany, and it would require a license to go from Germany to China. We don't require a license from the United States for it to go from Germany to China because we have this license exception APR that allows that to happen, because the theory is our ally, who is also a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement, Germany, is going to be licensing that. So we trust our allies to do it right. So the question is, what happens to these 2 license exceptions? And just by the way, these are the A1 countries that we trust currently to make that judgment call. Frankly, I don't think if Trump doesn't rush up the getting rid of license exception APR, I think a Biden administration is likely to keep it. Why do I think that? I mean, the Biden administration has talked about, not poking the eyes of its allies. So really one of the main things is keeping APR is you're sending a message that, yes, we do trust our major allies to get it right. So I think that that's something that's going to be on there. Are they going to put back license exception CIV? Well, that's one of the reasons that the Trump administration is rushing through so many things right now, is because it's not so easy to reverse things. Once you get the rule out, the rule's published, everyone, starts to comply with the rule. To reverse the rule completely is chaotic as well. So I think one of the ideas of the Trump administration is to get as many things out, throw the spaghetti at the wall, see how much of the spaghetti sticks to the wall. So I think APR may be safe, but frankly, I'm not sure how that affects you guys anyway. Another one area where I don't see much change is emerging and foundational technologies. What has happened to date is essentially we've had 4 rounds of emerging technology controls in the United States, and 3 of them have been multilateral. Only one of them was unilateral. There's one now that's proposed that needs to be added to this list. But again, it's one that I think that while it may start out as being unilateral and it's only a proposed one, it may actually go multilateral. So what has the Trump administration done? They've been actually pretty cautious about the emerging and foundational technology controls. They haven't gone out and like put unilateral controls on a whole bunch of things. Only one thing has been subject to these unilateral controls, and it's actually a pretty narrow item. So where do we see there? That's the item that's been the unilateral control. So in addition, the Trump administration put out the advance notice on foundational technologies and talked about 3 areas for potential export controls. None of these are particularly controversial. Thinking about controlling more items for military end users and end uses, this is consistent with the military end use rule. Thinking about, controlling more items that could be used to develop conventional weapons or used for intelligence gathering. Nothing weird there. And then they also have, controlling things that have been subject to illicit procurement efforts. Again, nothing particularly strange and weird. So I would think the Biden administration here would just simply be rolling along under the same approach to emerging and foundational technologies, attempting to get the major multilateral control regimes, which is the Wassenaar regime, the Australia Group for Chemical and Biological Weapons, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and the Missile Technology Control Regime, to sign on. And that way, it's not just the U.S. is doing it, because if the U.S. is the only one to control, then our controls are not particularly effective because the rest of the world can continue to sell. So unlikely to change there. The CFIUS review standard, which I skipped over, I'm sorry about that. I should go back a slide and just make a point there. So in October, the CFIUS rule was officially tied to export controls. So a foreign company buying a U.S. company or investing in a U.S. company has to make a filing to CFIUS if the U.S. company would need to get a license, essentially, to export, re-export, or transfer its technology to the company, the persons who are actually acquiring the company. So it's essentially saying, would I need an export license to, if the person who's acquiring my company if I would to take the technology and hand the technology to that person, would I require a license? And that's the standard. So it's made us export control lawyers feel good, because we feel more important now, because now we're a little bit more closer to CFIUS. We were just kind of cozying up to the CFIUS people, but now we're like, we decide when you actually need to make a CFIUS filing. So I don't think that's going to change. That's actually a pretty good standard, I think. So I don't want to cut off too much time. Oh, let's talk a little bit about TikTok and WeChat. That's gone really quiet over the last month or so. So back in 2019, we had this IT supply chain order that was issued May 2019. And the president essentially said there was a national emergency with regard to the creation and exploitation by foreign adversaries of vulnerabilities in information and communication technology. Last fall, Commerce proposed a rule that frankly was pretty crazy in November, and they got a lot of comments, mostly negative. I'm not sure if there were any positive comments in response to the Commerce Department's rule. It was, vague and potentially unconstitutional, among other things. But it was that not the rule, but the underlying executive order, because the rule never became finalized. That's one of the things that the Trump administration could still try to finalize before January 20th. But in August of 2020, we had TikTok and WeChat. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States was on one side reviewing the acquisition by ByteDance of U.S. app Musical.ly, which ByteDance rolled into TikTok. And CFIUS decided that ByteDance must sell TikTok, and that is still ongoing. They keep on rolling back the date and figuring out what the deal is going to be. But at the same time, in August, the president signed 2 executive orders, one on TikTok and one on WeChat, banning transactions to be identified with those apps. And Commerce Department on September 20th came up with a whole bunch of prohibited transactions. The courts have essentially decided that this is not going to happen. And so courts both in Pennsylvania, DC, and in California have all said this is unconstitutional. We're putting a preliminary injunction. So that's where things stand right now. So one of the things the Biden administration has to decide is, what are we going to do? I'm sorry, I went a little too far. What are we going to do with WeChat and TikTok? Really, best guess is to figure out what comes out of the courts. You could let the courts run it and see if the courts continue to figure out that it's unconstitutional, and then just sort of let it die on the vine. But I think the underlying executive order, the supply chain executive order, I don't think that one's necessarily going to die. If I were in the Biden administration, I would look to trying to figure out if there's a way to actually put some meat on the bone so that it actually works and it protects the United States, because it's a real threat that the U.S. government, not just the administration, but also Congress, has recognized is the possibility that companies and countries that are looking to infiltrate the United States could send us technology that would allow that to happen. So if I was looking in my crystal ball, I would say there's a good chance that they will try to hold on to the IT supply chain executive order and just make it work a little bit more smoothly than it has. So on economic sanctions, and then I'm going to wrap it up. So you have 3 slides on from a colleague of mine, Matthew Tushpan, who came to us from OFAC last year, and you have some quotes from President-elect Biden about who's a thug and who's not a thug. So it makes them for interesting reading. I think the North Korea sanctions are going to continue in effect. There's not going to be any change there. As in the past, China is a key player. So the U.S. government, to the extent it works out a deal with China on one of a number of different things, North Korea will be one of the topics that the U.S. government needs to talk to China about. I'm not expecting any changes on China in the economic sanctions area. Economic sanctions has been particularly aggressive with respect to China and with respect to forced labor in China. And naming a number of different companies in the Xinjiang province. They've also been quite aggressive with respect to Hong Kong and the Hong Kong designations. I'm expecting all of that to continue. Burma could be brought back because things are certainly not going well there. Cuba is a big question. The Trump administration reversed only some of Obama's policies with respect to Cuba. A number of both the OFAC relaxations and the Commerce Department relaxations remain in effect, notwithstanding the Trump administration. But certainly Biden could decide to move back a little bit and go back a little bit more towards the Obama administration views on Cuba. How far he's willing to go will depend, again, a little bit on Florida. He did not win Florida. And so he has to be taking that into account as he looks at Cuba. So I'm going to skip over the rest and allow my colleague Leah to take over with the Trump trade agenda because I don't want to cut her off.
Great, thanks, Kay. And I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. But obviously, as I'm sure you can see from Dan's presentation and from Kay's, we're coming off of a very active 4 years for international trade under President Trump. Dan talked a little bit about the various tariff actions that have been implemented, and I'm going to drill down a bit deeper from a trade lawyer perspective on how those actions have impacted U.S. companies and how they might change under President-elect Biden. So I thought it'd be helpful first to recap Trump's trade agenda. So President Trump uncovered some buried provisions within the Trade Act, like Section 301, and the Trade Expansion Act, like Section 232, which hadn't really been widely used before. And he used those to impose what we refer to as special tariffs outside of normal customs duties. The media really refers to them as trade wars. So he has imposed these tariffs against some of our perceived adversaries like China, but also against some of our historic allies like the EU. And in the case of the Section 232 tariffs on raw materials like steel and aluminum, on just about everybody. So we have been busy navigating those tariffs, advising clients on how best to deal with the sometimes unexpected nature of those tariffs and often unpredictable nature of the exclusion process over the past 4 years. In terms of what we expect to change under Biden, first and foremost, we do expect that he will review all of the tariff and non-tariff actions implemented by President Trump. That is because of the criticism that those actions have received. And also in the case of Section 301 and Section 232, those tariffs now are facing court challenges at the Court of International Trade. So we're expecting a bit of a more focus on the real mechanisms of how those tariffs and the exclusion process function that might drive some further changes. That being said, the tough on China policies that we saw under President Trump are likely to continue under President Biden. We don't expect the special tariffs to go away entirely. And now that this can of worms has been opened with Section 232 and Section 301, it's likely to remain open and really become part of the cost of doing business internationally. That being said, as Dan mentioned, we do expect things to be a bit more measured under President-elect Biden. We expect, for example, a more robust and predictable exclusion process from the tariffs, better compliance with the statutory and regulatory requirements to avoid these types of court challenges. And we also expect President Biden to prioritize multilateral diplomacy again. So under President Trump, we saw a real shift towards bilateral agreements and prioritizing those types of things. We expect a shift back to multilateral diplomacy under President-elect Biden, and a more deliberate integration of foreign policy and trade to combat some of these emerging issues like supply chain security, national security, and of course, COVID-19 and ensuring pharmaceutical supply chains and the availability of medical supplies. So that being said, we're expecting things to be more predictable and more measured under President-elect Biden, but a lot of the specifics of his trade policy remain unknown. And so from that perspective, we are still in a time of considerable uncertainty when it comes to trade. So many of the pressing trade policy issues that I mentioned, like the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, the Section 301 tariffs on imports from China, the countermeasures on imports from the EU that have been imposed pursuant to the Boeing Airbus dispute, as well as ongoing investigations as to digital services tax and the U.S. position when it comes to regional trade in Asia and trade with China in particular. In, for example, a response to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. On all of those things, the position of the Biden administration remains unknown. So as Dan mentioned, President Biden has said that he has a robust trade plan, and it will be announced the day after the inauguration. So until then, we are kind of in a wait and see point with all of these actions and what will happen. We do have a bit of insight from the naming of the transition teams at the USTR and the Department of Commerce. As Dan mentioned, there's still a heavy labor focus in terms of the people who have been named to those teams. They're representatives from unions and the Alliance for American Manufacturing, which indicates that the America First, Buy America manufacturing focus will remain strong. But there are also representatives from more liberal think tanks and international cooperations. So that also shows that things might be a bit more measured. At least we hope so for our collective sanity. So I'll leave a few minutes for questions, but just to sum things up, we do expect things to be less chaotic going forward, but we don't expect that trade will be falling from the news entirely, and it will remain a hot button issue for the next 4 years. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions. I know we only have a few minutes.
We do, and if anyone has some specific questions, be sure and pop them in the chat. I'm watching. With so much, we covered a lot of ground with you guys. I think that was a whirlwind 45 minutes, but with so much uncertainty coming into the new year, are there specific sort of trade information and news sources that you're watching for up-to-date information about these new trade policies as they're rolling out? Like, what do you suggest for our members who want to stay informed as we transition into this new administration? What are the best places to look?
So I'll let Kay and Dan fill in, but we all have alerts set up for Politico and International Trade Daily or Trade Today. They do daily updates, which are really helpful. If there are specific countries or trade issues of interest, Google alerts are really good for tracking those. Kay or Dan, any other news sources you can think of?
I have a couple. Many of you are at large corporations that have an internal government relations function, but by the time those folks get you something, it can even be a couple hours old or 3 hours old. One of the things that we do in our government relations practice areas, we monitor the Twitter feeds and press releases from the two committees of jurisdiction, Senate Finance Committee and House Ways and Means Committee. It helps you get the lowdown reactions to new policies, new initiatives, schedules of hearings and who's testifying. And then also USTR and Commerce, we follow those pretty actively as well. I think Leah's absolutely right. There's some excellent media that are out there, but I would consider as a primary source, the USTR or Commerce Department or Exim Bank Twitter feeds. This administration, the current administration, has done a very good job of using social media from the top on down, just to say it mildly. And I think that the committees of Congress are good places to track as well, to see how things are rolling.
So just to add on to what Leah and Dan have said about their areas of expertise, we keep an eye on the Bureau of Industry of Security, Office of Foreign Assets Control, and State Department, DDTC, both their websites and also the advance notices of proposed rulemaking or not proposed, final rulemaking. No, quite frequently we'll get we'll see in the advance part of the Federal Register something that's going into effect that day, because that's how the Trump administration has done a lot of its export control rules, on the day that it actually not hits the Federal Register, but hits the public reading room. So we'll check those. Those are good things to check. And then I'm kind of fond of a little trade thing that comes out every Friday called the Washington Tariff and Trade newsletter. So call out the WTTL. It's nice because it's only 6 pages long or 5 pages long. It's really short. And then the other thing is, if you don't know him, James Bartlett sends out a daily email with a lot of different export control things in it, and it's 100% free, and you just have to write to Jim Bartlett for it. So that's another one that a little call out there.
And I would also just add, as a lobbyist, part of what we do is we don't just trust the media to do the job. We go out and proactively reach out to agency officials and congressional staff and folks like that. So we try to make sure that we're not just relying on these other sources, and we try to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, that's just for additional, a little light reading on the side.
That's the value add.
You can't track everything 24/7. So this sweeps up the little things that maybe you're not tracking, but you still have to know what's going on.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, my colleagues I know are going a million different directions at once, and it's really hard to keep track of all these things, especially in as fast paced as the environment has been in recent years. So just having like a place to look to get a baseline for what's going on is very helpful. So I want to just, on behalf of our members and guests, say thank you to the Arent Fox team for joining us this hour and giving us a quick summary of sort of where we've been and where we think we might be headed, and some resources as well. We really appreciate your time. And as with the previous panel, in my wrap-up email, I'll provide the contact information for anybody who would like to reach out to them directly for more information. So with that, thank you so much, Dan.
Thanks. We should give credit to our puppet master, Bob Ernest, our partner who works with you, Rita, and who asked the three of us to do it. And since he has naked photos of me, I said, I'll do it, fine, whatever. But
well, by whatever means got you here. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We really
thank
appreciate
you, Bob, and we will not embarrass you further.
See y'all.
Thanks.